I ended up making friends online and I built a community that appreciated my work and they didn't care how old I was and they didn't really care where I'm from. And this was quite important.
Yatsu grew up in Vienna, started his career at Atari, and built his first internet company in Hong Kong in the 90s. Today, he's the co-founder of Animoca Brands, a $5 billion giant leading Web3 gaming and NFTs. Yatsu's journey is a masterclass in staying ahead of the internet revolution.
Even though we have different information and different access to it, as humans, we are social and we seek social connection and we want friendship. Like whatever those things that we wanted is the same now as it was 1,000 years ago. Computers were meant only to be used in offices, and IBM famously didn't do anything in personal computing because they said, nobody will ever use such a good device at home. Why do we think gaming is going to be big this year? There are two major gaming events that are going to change everything.
Hello and welcome to Build It Up, where AI meets crypto, technology meets humanity, and East meets West. I'm Bill Chen, the co-founder of Cypher Capital. Subscribe now and be part of the conversations. My guest this week is Yatsu. He is the co-founder and executive chairman of Animoca Brands, a global leader in blockchain and gaming industry, focused on bringing digital property rights to gamers and internet users. Back in 1995, Ya launched Hong Kong's first free web page and email provider. A few years later, in 1998, he founded Outblaze and later sold its messenger unit to IBM in 2009. Today, under his leadership, Animoca Brands has invested in more than 400 blockchain projects, shaping the future of decentralized gaming and the open metaverse. He is really a successful entrepreneur with a deep impact on both Web 2 and Web 3. Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I think most of the audience would be very interested about your transition, from Web 1 to Web 2 to Web 3. I guess you started your career as an entrepreneur even as early as Web 1, right? So could you talk about what is the transition? What's the story behind the journey?
I would say my transition probably happened at Web 0, in the sense that
Okay,
I was
before the web.
before the web. I was born in the 70s, so just to give a little context of age. My very first online experience was something called CompuServe, and CompuServe is really a bulletin board system. It wasn't connected to the internet, so it wasn't a Web 1. It was literally we had modems. Actually, I used an acoustic coupler in the very beginning, and we would connect to basically think of it almost like think of it basically as a Reddit type service, and that's all you could do. Right? And you would basically don't even have an internet. You have to use a phone to
When
dial
was
in.
that?
So this was in the 80s, like 80, 82,
Wow.
83. Yeah, that's a long time ago.
You got access to the computer very early.
Yeah, so I was born in Austria, born and raised in Austria, which wasn't very tech savvy, but and originally my parents were studying music. My dad became a businessman, and so what happened was he bought a computer for accounting support, because back then the computer was really just a giant calculator, but nobody in his office knew how to use it. So the computer was never used. So he brought it home. And when he brought it home, I basically, first thing I did was play games on it. It was a Texas Instrument TI-99, and the game was called Parsec, for anyone of you old enough to remember what that is. And then afterwards, I started learning how to code, and it sort of got me to the next stage, which was a Commodore C64. And the Commodore C64 actually was perhaps the first unit that really sort of connected onto things like CompuServe. And in order to download games and applications, you had to be online, right? So-called online. It was really a centralized database system, and we had to pay per minute to the provider in order to access that. So everything was done in batch, and of course the applications were smaller. So that's kind of how one of the main reasons we went online. And then of course I would build my community and get to know people from it, from that as well. So that was kind of the early days. And the context of this, what got me into the space, was I ended up writing MIDI software, and this is when I had an Atari, because the Atari had MIDI ports. So I would basically composition software, and people appreciated it. And then actually they sent me literally they sent me money in the mail as a form of appreciation, which of course I couldn't cash in because I didn't have a bank account. However, it was certainly
In the format of PayPal or
no,
how they
no,
can send you the money
no,
by
it was a check. It was a paper check, right?
Oh,
So for those of you who may not know, there was this concept in the 80s called shareware. And it was, it was public domain software. And what people would do at the end of the code, they would always give their address and the details. And if you appreciate it, you can send some money because there was no PayPal. I mean, there's no online payment system of any type, right? And of course, most
no.
people did it only for bragging rights. People didn't do it because they thought to send money. It's like, it's a kind of recognition to say who wrote the software, who's behind it. It was kind of building your online reputation, as it were. Like, oh, he wrote good software. We
Yeah.
appreciate it.
So
People who
people send the check by mail, like
By
paper
mail,
check?
by mail. So it would arrive like 2 weeks
Oh,
later,
okay.
right? And so
Wow.
so now back then in the 80s, just to add sort of more color to the story, um, they would send you money. Most of them were in the US, so they send you money in US dollars, a US dollar check. But I had basically, in Austria, we used to use a shilling. This was before the euro. So there was so this whole thing was just messy and impossible to deal with. But it was just an interesting time. But what attracted me about this wasn't like I wasn't thinking about internet or Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. These are all concepts that, really developed much later. I ended up
Yes.
making friends online and I built a community that appreciated my work and they didn't care how old I was because I was like a kid, right? And they didn't really care, frankly, where I'm from. And this was quite important because I grew up in Austria and really most of Europe still today is not very, I'm Chinese, right? And so there's not
Mm.
a lot of Asian people there. Can you imagine how many Asian people who were in Austria back in the
Yeah.
day, right? So
Yeah. So you can still feel the pressure.
well, yes. So, but actually, online, you build a community that is actually colorblind, right? And
Exactly.
and it's not to say that there was active racism. It wasn't like that. It was much more like,
Mm-mm.
oh, the joke was at least in the 80s and maybe even 90s, if you're Chinese, then you're going to run a restaurant, right? That was
Mm.
from a
That's a prototype.
that's the prototype, and now it's gone to maybe scientists and people who are good at math or whatever, like the model minority myth, right? However, before that was the image, right? And so
Mm-mm.
the opportunity for someone like myself to excel in Europe would be very difficult, if it wasn't for online. And so it enabled me to go into tech, and I ended up getting a job at Atari that then ended up sending me to the US to study computer science, right? So the opportunity space just expanded because I went there, and so that attracted me. And so my whole life essentially, really, if you could say, the opportunity began with let's call it digital online experience. And so my
Mm.
transition to all the various areas of the web just came from the fact that I was kind of a quasi product of that, but it was very early. I mean, I think when I joined CompuServe, there were maybe 100,000 users, maybe 150,000. Like that was a state of the pre-internet era.
Yeah, back then, if you compare the community in the pre-internet or early stage of the internet as compared to the Web3 community, what do you think the difference, or like do they share some common features?
I think there's a lot of commonality. But let me first talk about sort of maybe the difference first. The first difference is, of course,
Mm.
technology has advanced, and this generation is really digitally native. So, I'm a digital immigrant, as in, I grew up in an analog world, right? And essentially adopted technology, maybe very early, but I adopted technology and I essentially learned essentially an online way, as it were. But, my children or you or the generations, prior, they basically were born into a world where this was commonplace. I mean, I didn't have, there was no cell phones, right? I mean, there was, smartphone, what is that, right? Like the smartphones
Yeah.
in the 80s, the personal computer, as we know it today as basically every PC, was an anomaly. All right. Computers were meant only to be used in offices. All right. And IBM
Mm.
famously didn't do anything in personal computing because they said, nobody will ever use such a good
Yeah.
device at home, right?
That's their
Um,
biggest mistake.
yeah, that's one of their big mistakes. They did many mistakes, but along those lines, right? Um, and companies like Apple and Commodore and Atari, and then later on, of course, basically with Windows, basically took over that market. But this was on the
Mm.
basis that people, wanted to have this type of device in their home. And then eventually you go to smartphones, right? And again, if you look at the evolution, right? I mean, most in my generation, the phone that really, really sort of became popular, actually, for me, wasn't even the phone because the phone was expensive. It was a pager, right? It was a StarTAC pager that
Yes.
then,
Yeah.
right? And then afterwards, Motorola. And then afterwards, Motorola started making phones. And actually, my first set of phones were either a Nokia or a Motorola. That was that generation. And then eventually we went to things like BlackBerry. And then afterwards, we finally got to the smartphone, right? So all these evolutions happened before we came to, let's say, the state that we're in today, which for a lot of people, over the last, let's call it 20, 30 years, would think it's steady state normal in terms of how you engage with, let's call it the online world. Whereas today, frankly, I mean, back then, it was completely disruptive and changing all the time because we couldn't find it, right? And I would say Web3 is kind of like
Yeah.
that as well, right? Web3 is kind of in this sort of evolution stage, but with people who are native. So that means that, the experiences seem a little bit kludgy, a little bit sort of unfriendly in the way that you might be familiar because of all the paradigm shifts and changes. So that's kind of some of the similar parallels. But when you talk about community and the closeness of it, I would say Web3 and the early communities, and even the communities in Web1 and Web2 when they form, that's actually something that's the same across. And that to me
Mm.
is, the fact that we're humans, right? And even though we have different information and different access to it, as humans, we are social and we seek social connection and we want friendships and we want to have a good reputation with the network. And like whatever those things that we wanted is the same now as it was 1,000 years ago. The only thing is how we express it is differently because it's of technology, but we want the same things, right? We want to live a good life. We want to be happy. We want to be maybe successful. We want to do good in society. Like whatever those things are that we seek, that hasn't changed. And so to me, when we talk about forming these communities, these friendships, what I appreciated was in the early days of the web, I didn't actually, we were often judged by sort of not where we were, maybe how old we are. I mean, that's the other thing. Today, if you're 15 years old or 20 years old, and you're good at something, you have an opportunity. Back then, if it actually knew my age, there's no way I would have entered any kind of professional field, right? You had to be,
Yeah.
you had to not just have a university degree, but at least have 5 or 6 years of experience, maybe more, maybe 10, and all that type of stuff, right? So success, the ability to have success for someone in the 80s would have had to be someone who was, much older than it is today, right? So all these things have changed, and what online allowed us to do was to really present our abilities in the most neutral way without being judged by everything else around it. And I think blockchain takes that to its natural extension because here I can trust you based on what you do online in terms of your assets or your ownership without you having to prove it to me because I can already see it. And so it's different forms of basically how you build stronger forms of trust, but it amounts to the same thing. Like when you think about why we end up using things like whether it's Uber or Amazon or so on, the ratings that they give to users, like the seller and the buyer rating. I mean, what is it? It's actually a kind of digital reputation system. It's a way to sort of measure.
Mm.
And now we try to seek how to
It's
get
a
a
credit
higher
scoring.
reputation. Exactly, right? So again,
Mm.
maybe the way we present it is different, but the desire is exactly the same.
So basically, you're saying, the human nature never change, right? Regardless what kind of attack to enable a new community.
Yes. But I also think
Mm.
that as new technology comes, I think it helps evolve our thinking around what makes us human. Right. So I think
Yeah.
there's a critique. Some people would say, "Oh, technology dehumanizes us." Right. We're on the screen all the time, whatever. But I would argue that actually technology sort of opens up what actually makes us truly human. Because
Yeah.
being a laborer and doing essentially sort of machine work isn't really a human thing. But we had to have people work in factories because there was no other way to do it. Now, when you think about AI, they can do that type of work. But now we have time to think about, well, actually, what is it that makes us human? Feelings or emotions or relationships or those type of things, as opposed to basically maybe the kind of menial work that perhaps maybe we weren't supposed to do because we're actually more creative and divergent beings.
Yeah, I have a very interesting finding. When I just let the AI to write a whole post for me on LinkedIn and got very few engagement, even they are perfect. But when I write and just use AI to check some, data points, etc., even it's imperfect, but it will got, way more engagement.
Yes, I think this comes down to authenticity, right? Which is at the end
Yeah.
of the day, when we talk about what drives us as humans, as social beings, we want relationships, right? All sorts of relationships, friendships or partners, doesn't really matter, right? And at the end of the day, what you seek for isn't a relationship for relationship's sake. You seek an authentic relationship. You want something that is real. And of course, again, I sort of, when we talk about technology, we used to think of real as only something we can touch and feel, right? Because obviously that was real. Like some people who are critical about the blockchain industry are like, Bitcoin is not real because, I can't touch it, right? But, that's nonsense because, intellectual property rights is not real in physical sense as well, but it is actually very real because it connects us and it's how we feel about it and how we interact. So it comes down to authenticity, right? Is this an authentic relationship? So when you write in your natural tone, the people that you have a relationship know that it's you with all its
Mm.
imperfections versus it's perfectly written and they can easily tell whether they know this, intellectually or not. It feels fake, right? And if it feels
Yes.
fake, then you just don't care or you don't engage, or maybe it feels off, right? And you're in kind of this uncanny
Yeah.
valley where you're just like not sure what to do with it, and then you just don't do anything with it. And you do that a lot, then you come across as fake as well. In relationships,
Mm.
is also like, when you meet someone and he doesn't seem authentic, after a few times you're like, this guy seems fake or this person seems not right. Those are the same thing. So I think we have always sought out authenticity.
And come back to the transition, from Web 1 to Web 2 to Web 3. I think, you have been along with the gaming industry for a very long time and also like, surf the wave of all the technology disruption. So how do you think the gamify, industry, I mean, in general, gamify has been a very important sector. Having said that, it's not that doing well in this sector, especially from the token price perspective. Do you think like in the gamify is under deliver regardless in a game sector or as a DeFi sector? Like, what is your view on that?
So there's a lot of questions here, right? So I would say first, I started with gaming back in, my first job, as I said, was with Atari in the 80s. So we're talking like really, really old days, including actually sort of, I guess, the early days of console. So seeing that
Mm.
evolution, again, what really took off in gaming was social, right? And in fact, today, if you look at something like Bartle's taxonomy of gamers, which is a kind of a way in which we try to decide what type of gamer you are, it shows that basically the majority of people play games for social reasons.
When was that? Mm.
Bartle's taxonomy of games really sort of became big because of games like Ultima Online, which was the first kind of online
Mm.
game. I mean, you had MUDs as well, but online game that was out there, and people trying to explain why are you playing this game. But even when you go into things like the early days of console, whether this is Atari or the Nintendo Famicom, a Super Nintendo, or that type of stuff, really the social engagement was in the living room. Right? It was a living room device. So you didn't play by yourself. You sat around with your family and you gathered, and it was kind of like a mini movie experience when you could play video games, right? That was kind of the early days. So the whole point is to say that gaming is ultimately a social experience. Even when the game in itself might not appear social, you would have people you go to an arcade, it's social as well. You watch
Yeah.
other people play, or they compete with you, and there's a leaderboard, right? So there's a social element, and we're just getting better at that. And there's today something like 3.4 billion people who play games on a regular basis. So it's obviously from an online perspective, the largest part in terms of the larger part of the online community. Now let's go a little bit on talking around sort of token prices, because I think generally our view on tokens, it doesn't matter if it's gaming, if it's L1, L2s, or if it's AI, uh, because of the fact that the utility and the narrative, let's call it the meme nature of the token, is much more geared towards narrative because of its financial nature. So, meaning that if something is popular, if something is sort of in the zeitgeist, then the token prices reflect that. So, I look at tokens kind of like an open poly market. Like in poly market, you bet on a position. But
Mm.
frankly, and I have a very interesting story with my own children. This was like last year, right? And I was talking about Chill Guy, and my kids were like, "Chill Guy? Like, why do you know Chill Guy? Like, this is a TikTok
Mm.
phenomena."
They're
He had
surprised.
Right? They were surprised. And I was like, "Well, so I was kinda cool, with my kids suddenly, right?" But the reason why that was is because I saw a token, and there was talk in the token world, which was obviously a meme that came from TikTok. But the whole point was that I was able to signify that. And that signifying, by the way, in the 80s and early 90s used to be MTV, right? When you watch things like MTV, what was popular, or maybe news or media, you would read that. It doesn't mean that I engage with it. I would just hear about it, right? And so when people are voting with their money, so to speak, it actually creates a different type of accuracy around the state of where the world is, but with a stake. And by the way, this could be 5 minutes, right? I mean, you have so many stories of like 15 minutes of fame and that's it. I mean, that's what most meme coins are, if at all, right? Right? And
Yeah.
then you have other ones that last, right? And they last because the narrative and the story has a deeper connection around that, right? And so this leads me essentially into saying, sort of, when you look at if you look at GameFi in terms of usage, it's actually very successful. We have something like 6.6 to 7 million daily active players on GameFi, which is a big number compared to before. We have companies like, a lot of people like, oh, Axie Infinity, Sandbox, yeah, they're gone. Not at all. I mean, at the end of the day, we're still talking about, billion-dollar tokens in this market. Okay, so let's just look at reality for a moment and say, if you run a project of any type and it has a billion-dollar market cap, you can't say that that is not successful. I mean, in the Web2 gaming world, that'd be like you're a champion. It's only in Web3
Yeah.
where we say, oh, it's not worth $10 billion. Let's not pay attention to, which is not reality because of the way capital forms so quickly. But that was only a moment in time, right? That was not really, like I think Axie and Sandbox both respectively had market caps in excess of $25 billion. Okay, I mean, that was nice, but for a moment in time. But are we really going to say that that was a real value back then? I think everyone recognizes that that was a moment in time, and that wasn't actually reflective of its actual value, right? But now where it sits, there's an interesting element where there's consistency around the value that's being built, and we'll build slowly up from that. So I would say GameFi is not at all sort of as its own category is actually very successful. If you look at what happened with Ton, right? The user adoption it's received for the numbers that have come in. Yes, there's been a lot of botting. There's a lot of users that aren't real, but they still onboarded tens of millions of users into Web3. And even though the token
Yeah.
prices are down, they're still worth hundreds of millions of dollars, which is more than can be said for other indie games. Now, why does the Web3 industry say it looks bad? Because they compare it to other tokens, right? And so the narrative of gaming in the last few years was negative, not because of Web3, but because broadly gaming has been flat. Right? Everyone was expecting gaming to grow post-COVID, but it didn't. Right? In fact, the opposite happened. Gaming was flat to
You mean
slightly.
even for the Web2, right?
Yes, even for Web2. So there's been a lot of layoffs in the industry. Console sales haven't done very well, right? And not a lot of new exciting content.
Is it because young generation spend more time on TikTok, etc.,
No.
instead of like
So
play
young
games?
generation, first of all, young generations play games, but the birth rate is going down. Right?
Oh, okay.
Okay,
So the real demand, the population is declining.
So there's that's the first point, right? There's a general steady state where it's not increasing as quickly because the audiences aren't being born quickly enough, right? I mean, that's just a macro thing in developed worlds, which is why the fastest growing markets in the world for gaming, at least in the past, are things like Africa, Saudi Arabia, Middle East. Why? Younger population, right? And the market where gaming used to grow really fast, which is like, China, Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, those were growing markets because you had young populations. Guess what? Aging population now, right? So it's kind of, there's a curve aspect. That's the macro, right? But the second issue, and this is a much, much bigger issue, and again, which I think will be solved this year. So we're really bullish on gaming by the end of this year, but then I'll explain exactly why. Gaming has been priced the same for the last 10 to 15 years. So when you buy a game, it costs the same, right? You go to, it hasn't changed, right? It's still $19, $29, whatever. But the cost of milk has gone up, right? When you think about what happened in sort of finance, with QE, basically, in real money terms, the gaming industry is making less money than before versus all other area industries.
But if you take a look of the big chart, the whole revenue of the gaming industry is catching up with the inflation or not?
No, it's not. It's not.
Oh, okay. So it's not beating the QE or inflation.
It's not, right? And so that's why gaming companies have been laying off because, of course, salaries have to go up, but the actual revenue you make doesn't, right? And then the other thing, what's also been an issue is a lot of centralization. So the game distribution is now going from Steam, from Apple, from Google, right? And so it's not that distributed. What that actually means is that they don't only just charge you 30%, they actually also charge you advertising money to advertise the game. And how much of that money that you spend advertising the game goes back into the development of the game? Nothing, right? So for every dollar that you make, not including your development fee, almost 50, sometimes 60% of your cost is out the door.
I think that's the highest tax rate from this digital, regime, right?
Exactly. And that's where Web3 is really interesting, because it breaks that. But just remember, not only do salaries go up, advertising cost has gone up. So the cost per user acquisition has very well adopted to inflation, even better so, shall we say, right?
The cost is inflationary.
Exactly. Cost is inflationary, but your revenue source is not, right? So there's been a general sort of stagnation in the macro. And during COVID, gaming exploded, just like blockchain and crypto and everything else, because everyone was digital and online. And so it felt like things were going to keep going, and it made sense. But then post-COVID, we saw the effect, right? So things like Zoom and whatever, obviously, the Zoom premium fell apart and all that kind of stuff as well, because while it's a super valuable service, it didn't sort of command that type of premium, because we actually still want to travel, and we still want to meet in person. And we still want to go to conferences, that type of stuff, which a lot of people thought maybe we wouldn't be doing anymore, right? So that's the current macro. And so gaming tokens suffer because the macro of gaming suffers, in the same way that AI has done well because the macro of AI has done well. We're supporters and investors in projects like ELYZA before AI16Z, AI16, the ELYZA DAO, or like Virtuals or Kip, or like all those guys. We're all invested in them. We're very supportive of them. But the reason these projects did well is because AI was the hottest topic, and in the past, not because only the project in itself. The narrative premium sort of commanded a lot of attention because of its potential. Right. Now, why do we think gaming is going to be big this year? There are two major gaming events that are going to change everything, to change the premium, put investment, create console sales. One, the launch of the Nintendo Switch 8. So you ask me, why has gaming been sort of a little bit sort of flat? Well, the reason why it's been flat is because there's been not a lot of new hardware coming out, right? In terms of when you think of Nintendo Switch, this Nintendo Switch 2, it hasn't released a new console in 8 years, right? So that's actually a big deal. And so when you have someone buying and selling a new console, the consumer buys new games to buy them, right? The average purchase is 10 to 12 games or more per console that you buy. So there's that one trigger. But the even bigger trigger, and I'll get to Web3 games shortly after, is GTA 6. So there's nothing bigger from a cultural perspective than GTA 6 in terms of gaming, culture, media, entertainment, whatever. We're just going to be talking about that basically by the end of this year. And they famously delayed. And again, they haven't launched in about 7 to 8 years. So now you ask people who are anticipating GTA 6, which is probably going to be the biggest game possibly ever. People are going to buy a new console just to play GTA 6. So what does it mean? GTA 6 basically will drive consumer demand, hardware demand, purchase demand. And when I buy a console, then I buy new other type of games. Also, and I think this is not confirmed, but we believe this will take place, GTA 6 is also going to push the boundary of pricing. You need someone to lead it. And if there's one game that can do it, it's GTA 6. Meaning
they're gonna break the stagnation.
They're going to break it, because they're going to say, you know what? It's okay to pay $70, $80, or $90 per game, right? And this is basically where once they do it, everyone will follow, right? Because it sets a new standard, which means there's been an immediate bump in gaming as a result. There's going to be a lot of demand. Investment capital will flow back into it. Because remember, our investing in gaming, not Web3. Web3 gaming has been okay. Actually, Web2 gaming has been down basically back to levels from 10 years ago, right? So it's really sort of come up and down. And so all of those cycles will continue to flow, which is why we think basically the end of the year and up to next year will be very, very big on gaming from a macro perspective. That, with this backdrop, Web3 gaming are all becoming better too, right? So that's why I think the correlation becomes stronger.
Do you think Web3 game is sort of like half semi sector under the game category in the global, and also semi subsector under the crypto? It's like half.
Yeah. So today Web3 gaming is really 80 to 90% crypto and 10% gaming.
Oh, okay.
right?
Mm,
So the
mm.
traditional gamer has not moved into a Web3 gaming. There's a couple of reasons. One, it's a platform issue. So, for instance, platforms like Apple and so on don't allow NFT usage inside games. Strange, but it is what it is, right? Steam has outright banned NFTs in games, even though there's some companies that are doing it. It's actually against the rules. So that's kind of one issue. This will change, but that's kind of that's a distribution issue. That's the first point. The second issue is that the type of games that Web3 games were before, mostly passive games, were very appealing to a certain type of audience that were more crypto native. Those are people who don't normally play games, but then got into gaming because of Web3 gaming. But the people who normally play games, like like Call of Duty or that type of stuff, were like, well, this is not the kind of game I want to play, right? But Web3 games have now caught up to that. If you look at things like Gunzilla, for instance, with Off the Grid, or when you look at basically different type of titles out there, they're starting to get to the level where they're AAA and the quality is there. And so, from a distinction standpoint, people are no longer sort of seeing that the game from a quality standpoint isn't something I would play. However, you have the added element of now I can trade or I can basically own the assets and I can grow from these areas. So this added ability that blockchain gives it an advantage. So today it is definitely a small subsector of general gaming, but like mobile gaming, I mean, mobile gaming was a small subsector between 2011 up until 2014, I would say. It was a maybe 10 or 20% of the global gaming business, right? This will very rapidly has obviously changed, and I think Web3 gaming will do the same. But we're going to go through that type of evolution first, and I think
Mm.
this year and the year to come will do that. And the reason why is because Web3 gaming is much better capitalized, has much faster capital formation, and when the macro of the market improves, they will improve. And user acquisition costs, that's the other thing. The superpower of Web3 is user acquisition costs in the form of these airdrops. Done right, it can really bootstrap community growth, which today is almost impossible for an indie game developer. So we're very bullish on gaming where it's going to go, but obviously um, at the moment, if you're not analyzing this way, you might not realize what's coming. At least that's what we think.
And how about the NFT and the meme coin? Do you think the NFT is sort of a declining because it's sort of like overshadowed by meme coin? What is your view on those two category?
Actually, I think they're very intertwined. I mean, you could argue, first of all, now sort of narratively, I think there's a correlation between sort of ETH prices and NFTs as well, because NFTs have really sort of
Mm.
grown in usage because of
On
ETH.
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 Yeah.
I mean, I know people are talking about basically sort of L2s extracting and that kind of stuff, but the demand of the market. I mean, to me, again, not a perfect example, but I sort of say, hey, in 21 and 22, we had OpenSea, you had the marketplaces, you had NFTs, right? You had a cycle around that. And of course, in the last current cycle, well, a little bit ending of that cycle, you have, on Solana, you have Pump Fund, and you basically have meme coins. And they kind of, when you actually compare the numbers and in terms of token prices, they actually show some very similar parallels. Having said that, what we're seeing now, because of interoperability and because of the fact that there's so much of a shared network, actually, at the end of the day, they do lift each other up because they're participating within the same network and growing network effects across, even if it's not proportionally the same. And basically, if you think about it, NFT collections launching meme coins or meme coins on Solana launching NFT collections are kind of the same thing, right? And why are they doing this? Because at the end of the day, meme coins are much more economic, but more broad, whereas NFTs are much more cultural and sort of easy to identify who are your closest community members.
So you think it's complementary instead of like overshadowed by?
They don't overshadow, and the reason they don't overshadow is because you need to seek distinctions between yourselves inside the community. The non-fungible nature is the distinction, right? What is the difference between let's say you have 1 million Doge, great for you, but if you have 2 million Doge, are you actually very distinctive from the one with 1 million Doge? Not really. I mean, we don't call someone a millionaire and then a 2 millionaire and a 3 millionaire. We just call them a millionaire, right? And then we say, well, maybe you're a billionaire. Oh, okay.
Multimillionaire.
Yeah, you're a multimillionaire. Right? But we don't say tens of millionaires or hundreds of millionaires because
Yeah.
at that point you're kind of in the same bucket, right? However, oh, you have a Picasso, you have a Rolex, you have a Lamborghini. Whatever those are, these are the distinctions.
Mm.
These are the non-fungible distinctions that give you an elevation in your community, a status that you seek, what we describe as social and symbolic and cultural capital, right? And that capital is non-fungible. Like your university degree is non-fungible, right? That's something you've earned. Your Picasso art is non-fungible. Your Stradivarius is non-fungible. Like these are things that matter to you. And in the digital context, it grows from that. So if you want to build deeper context in your community, if you want to create more cultural investment, you must have NFTs. Now let's go to the numbers. We can say, oh, NFTs are not doing so well. But even in this, it's a pretty bearish market at the moment in relative sense. And if you look at the last 30 days, NFT sales is around $600 to $700 million. Which for a non-fungible character is actually really good. It's almost $1 billion, right? In comparison to other areas of assets, that's actually really, really strong, right? And the other thing is it doesn't have the same liquidity, but it's by design, right?
That's true. It's like us industry.
Exactly, right? It's not
Mm.
meant to be traded in this volume. The fact that you can trade it easier is a function of blockchain, but it's not to be compared this way. It's like saying, oh, because I can sell my Picasso within 1 second, it's more valuable. Not at all, right? So I think they're complementary. And if you want to build a community, you need to build culture. And you can't really build strong culture in any ecosystem unless you have NFTs. And let me sort of distinguish that. With meme coins, because of the fungible nature of tokens, you create a very transaction economically cycled community, which is fine as a base point. But then you need to enrich it. If you're only here for the money and not for anything else, then you will go anywhere else, right? So you have to build a community that is here for that community, and that comes from cultural from cultural investment, and that's frankly how the actual economies work, and that's the important role that NFTs play. So whether this is gaming, whether this is a collection of PFP, whether this is media and arts and entertainment, that will all come into bear. And I think NFTs have really only seen the beginning. We're not even close to where it's going to go. At the end, we won't see the same volume as meme coins or any tokens compared to NFTs, but I think we'll see much more value in the NFTs in comparison to like locked value.
Thank you. Yeah, now I feel more comfortable for my holdings of Punk and Ape.
Yeah, I still hold over my apes. Actually, I think I bought a few more and Pudgies and whatever. Again, the reason why I buy them is because I think of them as important cultural artifacts of their time. Like NFTs, like art, they have to mean something to you, right? I mean, if you just speculate and for the money, it's one thing. But for people like us, who have come and, got opportunity from this space, we want to own things that signify meaning to us and maybe also meaning to the communities we want to address. I mean, you see this, right? If you go to a meetup and they see your Bored Ape or your Pudgy Penguin, they're like, hey, me too. And by the way, this is cool. Or that's something that you can't really buy in the traditional money sense, right?
Yeah, that's very well said. Let's pivot gear to a little bit. I understand, Animoca not only doing, the game studio, venture arm, etc., and also incubation. And in past 1 year, I understand you also launched a very successful market making operation. So can you share a little bit, what's the context and how does it, contribute to your whole sort of a strategic
Yeah.
map?
So we actually reported our financials just like a couple of weeks ago. And in the financials, basically, of the $314 million of revenues, something like 165 came for what we call digital asset advisory, which comprises us helping launch tokens, support the project, design tokenomics, and of course, includes market making and trading activities. Now, why is this relevant? So first of all, we didn't want to become a market maker. We were using third-party market makers, and we still partner with them. We still work with many market makers. It's not just us. We have to collaborate. But we realized that, in the sort of 22, when FTX and Luna and all that stuff happened, we needed to cut cost, right? Like everyone else. And we were paying millions of dollars to these market makers. We're like, well, maybe we can take it in-house, build a team. And then we came to realize, hold on a second, actually, this can generate sort of cash flow, except that cash flow was never shared, right? We're working with them and many market makers who were basically just constantly just selling tokens and just basically just weren't really doing what we thought they were doing. And that's partially because if you want to be supportive of the project and provide liquidity, we have to be in control of that. And in the good times, you make money. In the bad times, obviously, you're providing, you're actually buying in the market. That's fine. That's how it works when you're sort of playing delta neutral. But because of the liquidity that's in the space, you can also hedge yourself, right? And I think this is something that I think most organizations in Web3 who are not financially oriented from the get-go, like an exchange or maybe a hedge fund or something, don't realize and understand, because Web3 is so financially sort of correlated. You need to have financial expertise as part. It's almost like, like in a traditional business, when you say you have a finance department, many times it's really accounting and receivables, right? That's
corporate finance.
like the traditional type of operating business finance, right? But when you say a finance department in a bank, it has a different function, right? Because it actually, a sort of revenue driver. In Web3, because blockchain is essentially creates financification everything, your finance department has to be a revenue center too, or at least within the umbrella of the finance department. It can't be viewed as simply an accounts receivable or an audit department, right? That's a function of finance, but it's different. And I think for people in Web2, they don't think of it this way. They don't think of, hey, I need to build a business, and then maybe I need to have a mini hedge fund built in this, right? It reminds me a little bit in early days of the internet when we said, you know what, every company needs a CTO, right? 30 years ago, we're saying every company, but they used to build their tech function out of the IT department, right? The systems team that were basically doing IT support, of course they couldn't do it because they had no idea. This was not their mandate, right? You had to build someone who was, you had to bring a CTO type or VP engineering type to engage with this. And of course today, there is no meaningful company out there that doesn't have a meaningful tech effort, right? I think to me, it's the same thing. If you want to be a meaningful Web3 company, you must have a meaningful financial department that it covers much more than that. And so the realization of this is why we built this team, which then basically helped us create liquidity in the market for the products that we wanted to support. And we also realized that a lot of our portfolio companies cannot build this expertise, right? Because it's difficult. Like, we're over 1,000 people today. We have a balance sheet that's like worth billions. We can support stuff with liquidity that, companies we invest in just simply don't have. And so we decided that this could be something that could be of value to them so that they can create sort of a relationship with their consumers. Because that's the other thing. If you market make, you can actually create revenue from the flows, right? And because, crypto is pretty inefficient, you can also do a lot of ARBs, right? And if you do that correctly, you can make money from that without actually having to sell down your token. And that creates actually a much more better relationship with your owner of the token, where frankly speaking, in let's call it the 21, maybe 22 way of thinking, was that you would have to sell the token in the market because that's how you generate income for the project. You create an adversarial relationship with your customer at the end of the day, right? So the evolution of this wasn't just, hey, how do we make money from this? The evolution was, what's the better relationship you can build with your token owners if you don't actually have to do it in a manner where you're basically just constantly selling, right? Which to be sustainable, so to speak.
That makes sense. You can maintain the relationship.
Correct, right? And then of course, because it's your treasury, you have the ability to hedge, which means that, if the markets go a certain way and you place the bad, place the bad put or something, your own token reserves become essentially sort of the collateral for it, right? So there are elements that make sense, and I think for younger companies it's hard to do, but it's something we learned about the space. So that's why we evolved in this, and we think it's very important for organizations in Web3 to have a function like this, or if they don't or can't, to work with someone maybe like us or others to build that. Now, market making is not our primary business, right? So in other words, we're not going to compete with, Wintermute, Amber, GSR, like all those guys are friends of ours and we love to work with them. The main point is though, that also because we have a market making team, we can now work with them in parity, and we can say what we, expect and need, in terms of, we can actually have ways in which we can actually sort of understand what they're doing, as opposed to, frankly, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we'll provide
It's a
you
black
liquidity.
box.
Okay, here, and we need this call option. Okay, like we just didn't know what we were doing, right? Because we were, a
Yes,
gaming company,
exactly.
right? And so
Yeah.
because we have this, so running a team like this isn't only about that. It's also about knowing about how such an important
The
part of the
knowledge.
space works, right? So all
Yeah.
of these things come together, and so of course these become business units of ours as well, because that's how you become sustainable. And now we write research reports, right? We have research reports. People, our Polymarket report was actually covered by Bloomberg. Our exchange listing report is covered by a lot of exchanges. People are asking questions and looking at it and analyzing it. Again, that's the capability that we brought in really to support research of our own projects first, and then expanding into the market, which becomes valuable for our own activities, but also for others, right? So to me, it's the natural evolution of a group like Animoca, because Web3 does not sit still, so we can't sit still either.
Well, thank you. Thank you, yeah, for all the insightful sharing. Yeah, I think that's pretty much today. And thank you
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great chat.
Well, that's all for today on Build It Up. We will be back next week with another inspiring guest. Subscribe now so you will never miss our amazing interviews. Until next time, this is Bill Chen. Goodbye and take care.